Well, good afternoon, everyone. Finally, we'll have a vote on S1 this afternoon. You know, there's been a lot of discussion, and many of you have written about the subject of big lies. Well, the biggest lie being told in American politics in recent weeks has been that the states are involved in a systematic effort to suppress the vote. Those arguments are being made by people who obviously haven't read any of these new state laws, because that's not happening. As we all know, we had the biggest turnout last year since 1900. There is no effort in any state in America to suppress votes based upon suppression of minority participation. What is really going on here isn't anything new. After the 2016 election, our Democratic colleagues, because of the Russian interference in the 2016 election, wanted to declare the American elections critical infrastructure as a rationale for the federal government basically taking it over. But because they didn't like the outcome of the 2016 election. They still didn't like it before the presidential election, and so S1, then HR 1, was passed in the House because of a need to sort of clean up the American election system. But then, alas, they got an outcome they wanted in 2020, so the rationale for HR 1 changed again, and this time it's to prevent states from trying to suppress the vote and to make it difficult for minorities to participate. Look, what this is really about is an effort for the federal government to take over the way we conduct elections in this country. It is a solution in search of a problem. And so finally today, we will put an end to it here in the Senate. The American people can be relieved that the federal government, at least in this area, is not going to expand and supplant the states which have been involved in conducting elections throughout the history of our country.
And just to re-emphasize the leader's point, this bill was never a serious attempt to make law, but don't take my word for it. This is how Politico characterized it this morning. This is a quote. "It's always been a messaging bill, a check-the-box move allowing party leaders to tell the left that they tried. And if it passed, it would carry serious consequences for the country." You think about the way that we've been doing elections in this country for over 2 centuries. The states have always been primary. They've been the principal entities when it comes to conducting elections across this country. This would consolidate, federalize, nationalize elections in this country in Washington, D.C. And that is not something, when the American people find out about it, that they're going to be for. Because basically they trust their states a lot more than they trust Washington, D.C. People in this country generally don't believe that Washington knows best when it comes to most issues. But that's what this bill would do. It would take the power away from the states, where it's been for the better part now, or over 2 centuries, and bring it here into Washington, D.C., where bureaucrats in Washington would be running elections in this country. If you look at the individual components of the bill, and you've heard us talk a lot about it, but there's no question that issues like photo ID have become very much accepted across the country. There are 34 states that have adopted photo ID laws. I think most Americans think it's a matter of common sense. There was a poll out yesterday or the day before that said that 80% of Americans support a photo ID when it comes to voting, because they believe, a matter of voter or ballot integrity, that when people go in to vote, they ought to be able to prove they are who they say they are. That seems like a basic fundamental premise when it comes to elections in this country. It's worked well in our state of South Dakota now for almost 20 years, and I can't imagine the federal government telling the state of South Dakota they could no longer use a photo ID when it comes to verifying when people vote they are who they say they are. The short of it is this is a show vote. This is a check-the-box exercise for the Democrats. They have never intended for this to pass, but they want to use it so they can apply pressure to some of their members to overturn the legislative filibuster, which is, again, another matter that this debate that we're having today is all about. But I believe that the American people want to know that their elected leaders here in Washington, D.C. are working on issues that are important to them. This is not an issue that the American people are talking about on a daily basis right now. And proof of that is in the last election, as the leader pointed out, we had record turnout, biggest turnout since 1900. People are turning out to vote in record numbers. This is a solution in search of a problem, and I hope that it is soundly defeated later this afternoon.
Today we'll be voting on S number 1, which means it is the number 1 priority for the Democrats in this country and in the Senate. They make it a higher priority than the economy and inflation, a higher priority than the crisis at the border or the crime in our cities. It is their number 1 bill. They say it's about election reform. It's actually about an election takeover by Washington. And it is very unpopular across the board, and there are a couple of reasons why. You just heard about voter ID. People believe that to get a ballot, you should have to prove you are who you say you are. That involves a photo identification. Sure, 80% of Americans are for it. 62% of registered Democrats are for photo ID. 87% of independents are for it. That's what makes their bill unpopular. Also, ballot harvesting, to have paid political operatives go out and collect ballots unsupervised and then decide what to do with them. And of course, taxpayer funding of campaigns. Over $1 billion would be sent to incumbents running for office, people running for office with a matching program that they have. People across the country don't like it. People of America know what they want. They want ballot security and ballot accountability. So my Secretary of State from the state of Wyoming sent me a several-page letter. I'm just going to read 2 lines from it. He's a guy that actually runs in elections. And he said this expansive legislation imposes unnecessary and unconstitutional mandates. And he closes by saying H.R. 1 would unravel all of the positive attributes of a decentralized election process at the state level, and it would implement requirements that will invite bureaucracy and fraud. He closes by saying, please vigorously oppose this misguided legislation, and I plan to do just that.
I think when Democrats started this effort, they thought they were going to be able to have this debate about, are you for a bill that would protect democracy? The problem was that was several months ago, and many people actually either read the bill or managed to read a story about the bill, or they were polled about the bill. And this is a bill full of things that people don't want to do, but most importantly, it's built on a foundation that people think is faulty. The best place to solve most problems is not Washington, D.C. Our friends on the other side think the best place to solve every problem is Washington, D.C. We have a system where the diversity of the system is one of the great strengths of the system. Hard to subvert American democracy when there are different systems in every state. Every state has developed an election process that works for them. This bill's not about more democracy, it's about more Democrats. And the federal government doesn't need to pass a bill that for 20 years has been the goal of Democrats in Washington. Every time they get in the majority, they pass H.R. 1 or try to pass S1. And once people figure out what they're really trying to do, it's not hard to be opposed to what they're trying to do.
So we'll take up S1, the Fund the Politicians Act, or was it For the People Act? It truly isn't for the people. It is all about consolidating power in Washington, D.C. This is a power grab for DC politicians and bureaucrats. And instead of focusing on the things that are really important to our constituencies back home, you know, the rising prices of goods that our families need every single day, these politicians here in Washington, D.C. have decided they want to focus on consolidating power, politicizing the FEC, focusing on ballot harvesting, funding their own campaigns with taxpayer dollars. Folks, I served as a county auditor in Iowa, which is also a commissioner of elections. And I trust the county auditors in Iowa at the local level, Democrats, Republicans, and the occasional independent in Iowa, much more than I trust a bunch of DC politicians and bureaucrats who want to run our local elections. So again, folks, this is all about consolidating power, a national power grab to take away the voices from our local elections officials and our state elections officials. So let's focus on the things that matter to our constituencies and less about these DC politicians' own wants and desires.
Last week I traveled around Florida a little bit, and I did a roundtable with small businesses. Every one of them seeing significant inflation. And as we all know, what's going to happen with inflation is going to hurt the poorest families in this country and people on fixed income. All of inflation is always caused by reckless spending. The Democrats have unbelievable reckless spending, and it's just the beginning. If you not just the bill they passed in March, but what they're talking about doing with a $6 trillion budget, which will have a big deficit, along with their other almost $7 trillion total of the spending, and Bernie Sanders now has another $6 trillion. So this has got to stop. We almost at $30 trillion for the debt. It's hurting our families all across the country. Over 80% of families have already tightened their belts, worried about the cost of food, the cost of gas, these things going up.
Yeah. Yeah.
In 2017, you modified the filibuster with a version of the nuclear option. What would you think if Democrats were to somehow creatively modify the filibuster again with something specific to say this voting rights?
Well, you've heard this before. There are two calendars in the Senate, the executive calendar and the legislative calendar. Until Bush 43 was elected, even though it was possible to filibuster the executive calendar, it was never done. The tradition was up or down votes for appointments. The best proof of how sacrosanct that practice was the Clarence Thomas nomination in 1991, arguably the most controversial Supreme Court nomination ever. Clarence Thomas was confirmed 52-48. I don't have to remind all of you, it only takes one senator to make us get 60 votes. Ted Kennedy, who was vehemently opposed to Clarence Thomas, Joe Biden, who was vehemently opposed to Clarence Thomas. No one said, out of 100 senators, no one said you have to get 60 votes. So that was the tradition until the early 90s when Chuck Schumer, then the freshman senator from New York, decided to start filibustering on the executive calendar. So the answer to the question is the executive calendar is one thing, the legislative calendar is another. The executive calendar is now 100% back where it was 20 years ago, simple majority. I'm comfortable with that. That used to be the tradition. That's where we are. The legislative calendar is the essence of the Senate, the very essence of the Senate. Change the legislative calendar and you have fundamentally turned the Senate into the House and completely destroyed the institution. So I admire the handful of Democrats left who are in the same position they were a couple of years ago when they were not only using the filibuster, but defending the filibuster repeatedly when they were not in the majority. So I do think that it's extremely admirable that there are at least a handful of Democrats left who believe in the institution.
You said that the big lie is about states repressing their votes. Are you okay with states like Arizona that's conducting its own audit to throw into question Joe Biden's victory there?
I'm okay with the states sorting this sort of stuff out. You know, the most important election in the country is the presidential election. It's not decided in Congress, it's decided in the Electoral College. Those are state-by-state decisions. And so, regardless of what may be happening in some state, there's no rationale for federal intervention. They'll figure it all out. They'll go to court. They'll determine whether or not there's any rational basis for this. That's not unusual in this country.
With all due respect to what Senator Doom was saying about people not caring about election issues out in the states, so many states are taking on this issue. Why not allow a vote to get on this bill and offer amendments on something like voter ID, which it does poll extremely well? Why not have that debate on the floor as opposed to shutting it down on the front?
Well, as Senator Blunt pointed out, this is not a federal issue. It ought to be left to the states. There's nothing broken around the country. The system upheld very well during intense stress in the latter part of the previous Congress. There's no rational basis for federalizing this election. Therefore, there's no point in having an election in the U.S., a debate in the U.S. Senate about something we ought not to do.
Many of your colleagues across the aisle have said that they support requiring ID for people to buy alcohol in states, but they don't answer me, or they refuse to respond when we ask if they would need to require an ID to vote. What do you say to that?
Are you talking about photo ID?
Yeah, they.
Well, I mean, lots of states are going to photo ID because it makes sense to verify that you're having that the person trying to cast the vote is really who they said they were. And S1 seeks to make that difficult or impossible. Americans think that having basic proof, verification, makes sense, because to the extent that people are voting who aren't entitled to, you're diminishing the vote of someone else. Thank you.